What if I told you that your team's biggest threat when it comes to AI isn't the tech, it's their behavior? Hey everyone, Mike Desjardins here, and welcome back to the Mike Method. In today's episode, we're diving into the future of work, the rise of generative AI, and the human skills that will keep us not only just relevant, but thriving. My guest is Kian Gohar, former executive director at XPRIZE and Singularity University, bestselling author of Coding in the New World of Work, and a global authority on the intersection of AI, leadership, and team performance. Kian has spent the last decade helping organizations from scrappy startups to the world's most iconic companies use AI and deep tech to solve their biggest challenges. But here's what makes Kian's work different. He believes the best way to beat the machine is to double down on being human. That means creativity, empathy, adaptability, trust, and radically collaborative teams. We talk about the ABCs of AI and how to think with AI, not just through it. Why most people get good enough results and how elite teams go beyond the first answer. A simple shift in your brainstorming flow that can 10x idea quality. The quiet crisis of AI adoption in workplaces and why the chief people officer, not the CIO, should lead it. And the 4 traits that define radical adaptability, a blueprint for thriving in a world of constant change. Whether you're leading a team, building a company, or just trying to keep up with AI, this episode will reframe the conversation and give you the tools to lead with more humanity, not less. Let's dive in. I really appreciate you making time to be on the podcast today. Thank you for being here.
That's my pleasure.
So December 2022, this little company called OpenAI decides to put out a small app on the web called ChatGPT. And it's met with quite a bit of fanfare, ends up being the most explosive growth of any type of software like that that's really ever happened. I mean, Spotify, I think, was in second place, and that had meteoric growth. You know, we're 2.5 years later, and we're talking about AI all the time, but adoption seems to, some people are using it every day. Some people haven't even used it yet. Some people are using it at work. Some people are using it for home fun stuff, but haven't figured out how to use it at work. Where are we at in sitting here in midway through 2025?
AI adoption is the critical link that is going to allow humanity to augment our creativity. And we are on this journey. Some people are further ahead, but I would say we're really just in like inning 2 of a 9-inning game. And we see that many technologies are being adopted, even in corporations that are really good at adopting tech. Over 75% of executives still don't even know how to use AI. And these are, white collar educated professionals. And so the adoption across all of society is going in fits and starts. And the truth is that until we have access for everybody to be able to benefit from this technology and for it to be cheap enough for everybody to access efficiently, it's not going to be something that will rise all boats. William Gibson, the science fiction author, once said that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And that's where we are right now in this moment of AI.
Right. The future is here. It's just not widely distributed. I think when I was reading over your Harvard Business Review article, where you worked with thousands of companies to see what AI adoption look like in companies, just to take it into a corporate setting. One of the things you noticed is that, and I'll just kind of use a euphemism like garbage in, garbage out, right? If you ask it a simple question, you're going to get a simple generic answer. And that the people that focused on using the tool that way and just accepting what came out, they got maybe a 2% increase in the generative ideas. But really what happened is it forced people to the middle. So they got to this like middle ground of kind of like, well, they got like average results out of it. But there was another group that used it differently and they got a lot better results. And I'm curious if you can share more about what you learned in that research that was published in Harvard.
Yeah, so think of generative AI as like a golden retriever. It is the world's best golden retriever. It just really wants to make you happy. And so it will give you information that it thinks is what you're trying to answer. Behind the scenes, behind this golden retriever is a massive algorithm. And this algorithm has been designed to predict what words and phrases should come after the next. So it is a big probability algorithm. And it is designed to give the most likely answer that you might be happy with. And that necessarily means it gives you a good enough answer, but not necessarily the best answer or the most creative answer. And in our research, we were kind of surprised, actually, we're shocked to find that AI is really good at getting you to a good enough answer, but it tends to not give you the best answer not because the technology is broken, but rather because we humans don't know how to use it. And so that aha was like, okay, well, how are some of these teams who are actually getting significantly better results and more creativity with AI? What is their workflow? How did they use it? They have the same technology that everybody else had in the study. How did they use it to be able to actually get significantly better output? And what we found is that their workflow was different. Their workflow wasn't, as we have been trained for the internet era, to go online to Google or any search engine and type into a little box, a perfectly phrased question to get the answer. And that's the answer. Google gives you a deterministic answer of what the best website is for you to go to. That's not how AI works. But most people use AI like Google. The teams who really had outlandish results or significant outperformed results, they didn't use it like a Google. They didn't use it like an Oracle. They used it like a conversation partner. They used it like a colleague at work or a friend, and they would have a back and forth conversation. At first, they would get the initial output, and then they would say, well, let me probe deeper into that. Let me ask you a question. I'm not sure if this is the right way, or maybe that's interesting. Can we go down this path? Just like you and I are having a conversation right now, they had this back and forth conversation with AI. And that required a change of behavior of how we interact with technology, which has always been for the last 30 years. We input something into this box. I call it the tyranny of the search box. That's how we've been literally ingrained. And instead, we have to change our behaviors to have a back and forth conversation with AI, not as a tool, but as a colleague or as a teammate. And that led us to this big aha, which was published in our research study at Harvard Business Review.
What I love that you said on a recent podcast, that you were on a Stanford podcast recently around innovation and creativity. And I think the phrase, and correct me if I'm wrong, you said is, we don't Google search our Google search results. Like, we don't go back to, if we put in a Google search, we just accept what comes out. So if we try to use a generative AI, whether it's Perplexity or Claude or ChatGPT, doesn't matter, in the same way, where we put in a query and then we get an answer back and then that's it. I think that's the concept that you're talking about, right? That just doesn't work. That's not how these tools are designed to be used.
Yeah, and there's also a little bit of human bias in there. And so we found in our research that most people settle for a good enough answer. And so maybe the first answer that Google gives you on its homepage, which literally is the most likely page that it recommends to you, is best for your answer. We have been trained to just accept the first answer. And our human behavior is one that we are satisfied with the first acceptable answer, but not necessarily the best answer. And there was this guy, Herbert Simon, who won the Nobel Prize in the 1950s for his work looking at this phenomenon called satisficing, and that we humans are happy with the first acceptable answer, and then we accept it and move on. And that, if we recognize that as a form of human bias, then we have to have pattern interrupts to stop us from just accepting the first acceptable answer and probe further. Most people, 85% of the people in our research study, accepted the first answer. And they said, wow, I got to a really good enough answer in 2 minutes instead of like an hour. Let me spend the next 58 minutes grabbing a coffee and talking to my colleagues, rather than pushing forward from that really good enough answer in those first 2 minutes to an excellent answer in the next 58 minutes. And that is just our human behavior and our biases. So we have to be cognizant of that. And then we have to design pattern interrupts and workflows that allow us to say, oh, that's a great starting point, but now let's push forward.
Right. So it's funny. Two thoughts come to mind. One is a friend of mine has an online travel booking business. And I love this quote from him. He said, "Hey, Mike, do you know where the best place to hide a dead body is?" I'm like, "I don't know." And he's like, "The second page of Google search results."
Also, never Google, where should I bury a dead body?
Probably not great. Yeah. But I think it's interesting because I know that what I found with ChatGPT, or actually any of the generative AIs, is that if I don't know the topic really well, then I get in that loop. Well, not a loop. I get into that process of just putting in a question, and then whatever the answer is getting back, then I kind of like accept it. But if I have knowledge, experience, wisdom, I've read, learned, whatever, been educated in a subject, and I ask ChatGPT, I right away know that's not the best answer. And I need to correct what I just asked and get into conversation because it's giving me the answer that somebody without my knowledge base would accept. So that's because I knew that going in. But for the things that I don't have an expertise in, I would be more likely to put in a question. And then when the answer comes back, I'm like, I don't really even know what the next question is. So I'm going to accept what this is because I don't have an expertise in this area. And I've really had to force myself to figure out how to get in conversation when I don't, and just not accept that first answer.
Yeah. So we have, as a result of our research, developed a framework that teaches critical thinking skills with AI, specifically around what you mentioned of how to push back, how to inquire, how to have these pattern interrupts to make sure that whatever it's telling us is actually valid and relevant to us. And you and I are having a conversation and we would push back or go in different directions.
Yeah.
It's natural to us, but it's not so natural to us in a digital environment. And so we developed this framework based on our research. We call it the ABCs of AI. And it's literally about how do you develop the foundational AI literacy to be able to interact with these large language models effectively. And one of those ABCs teaches you how to ask AI to ask you for help. So let's say you have a topic that you don't really know a whole lot about, or maybe you don't know what kind of context to provide AI so that it gives you meaningful insight. And one of those ABCs is for AI to interview you about that particular topic or that particular interest. So that way it has more insight as to give you better feedback. And so instead of providing the context that you think you want to learn about this particular, I'm just making this up, like cooking recipe, why don't you ask AI to ask you 3 or 5 questions about this meal or about this feeling that you want to have, and then it can then give you a lot more personalized and relevant information. So the hack is, instead of always having a one-way telling AI something, actually ask AI to ask you, and then you respond, and then you're able to have a much more fluid conversation about that particular topic.
That's a very innovative and thoughtful approach to flipping the script on entering things into a text box, but instead setting up the AI to ask me the questions that I know the answers to, but I didn't know the questions to get those answers out of myself that would lead to that conversation. I think that's what I hear you saying. Yeah. Let's talk about brainstorming. So, we're in a day and age where, we've talked about using these AIs to get answers to questions. So how do you effectively use AI in the context of brainstorming? Because I can see where, if we just, as we've talked about, if I wanted it to do the brainstorming for me, I would just enter in a query, it would give me an answer. And then I would think, oh, well, brainstorming's done. I don't need to do any more work. And if we're on a team, now we got a team of people looking at a screen, we've asked ChatGPT, it's given us the answers. Then we would take those answers and we would go work through that. But there's something missing there in that process. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think the most important thing I want to get across in general is that we can't mindlessly accept content and ideas from AI. Sadly, it's very easy to copy and paste. And this is what a lot of people do when it comes to using AI generated ideas. And it's really actually reducing our critical thinking skills. And so instead of just mindlessly accepting whatever content AI generates for us, I think it's critical that we create deliberative creative friction in the process. And what I mean by that is, again, pattern interrupts that allow us to zoom out, use AI as a tool for generating lots and lots of ideas. And that could be asynchronous, it could be one-on-one with AI, it could be teams with AI, and then actually slowing down like a bottleneck and saying, okay, now let's put the ideas on the table and let's decide as humans which of these ideas are actually in congruence with our values and with our end goals. And then we make human-based decisions on which of these we should go forward with. Sadly, most people don't do that. And they just ask AI for generate a list of 5 ideas for this particular problem. They pick one of them and they run with it. That, I think, is really important for us to have the human decision-making and empathy in the loop. And so that, I think, is the most important thing. This idea for deliberative creative friction. That's what gets us to really good ideas. So let me step back. That's ultimately where we want to be. But the first step is ideation and brainstorming. And you can say, come up with 10 ideas for me around my, latest song that I want to write about, and give me a title for that. And, it'll be pretty generic. And so we have to, again, prompt AI, and we have to push it in ways that gets feedback. Generate 10 ideas. Okay, how about you generate 10 more ideas? Ask it for more and more ideas. and then tell it which ones you like. Oh, I like idea number 17 and idea number 4 because of this and because of that. And now can you give me 5 or 10 more ideas based on a convergence of idea 4 and idea number 17? And so now you're kind of giving it more feedback again as to the direction you want it to go down. And so I think AI is a wonderful tool for expanding the idea set. And there's many tools that we can use to get to more and more creative ideas. But then ultimately, we have to put the human in the middle and say, okay, which of these ideas are aligned with where we want to go? And that ultimately requires us this deliberative creative friction to pause, to take a breath, and then collectively decide which way we want to go.
It feels like there is this polarity that's being created here where, and this is Greg Smith, a friend of mine who's got a company called Thinkific, who's been on the podcast. And he sort of said, listen, as we're driving towards this lack of personalization in AI, where we're chatting with a bot, it's going to drive a counterbalancing force, which is this deeper need for human connection. And those two things are going to rise at the same time. So I almost wonder, and I'd love to get your hot take on this, like from a brainstorming perspective, imagine a team is coming together. Would it be in the team's best interest to actually do the brainstorming together first, generate a bunch of ideas, then put those ideas into generative AI and say, can you expand or remix the ideas that we've come up here to generate a whole new series of events, and then take that, go back to the team and say, which of these ideas do we like now that we have a more fulsome data set to work with, drill down on 2 or 3 of them, then go back to the generative AI. And so it's almost like a blend of like human interaction to start, AI support, human interaction, decision-making, AI support. Do you see that as like as a flow that sort of more matches the research that you've done and the work that you've into what you've discovered?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great flow. I would add one more step, and that would be
Please.
step 0.
What's step 0?
Step 0 is before you get to the team to have that ideation is to do it individually and asynchronously on your own. Because we know from team dynamics that if you get into a room or a virtual room, the people in the room will automatically influence how people respond. And there are others who may not speak up because maybe they're introverted or maybe they don't know if they have enough authority to speak. And so in order to counterbalance that, we want to make sure that we begin with ideation always individually on your own, whether with AI or without AI. So that way you can get your thoughts together before you get to a team environment, so that then you can start that process that you just outlined, which works really well.
I love that. We, in the work that we do in my company, we do strategic planning. And one of the things we have leaders do in advance of, to prep for the session, and we call it mindstorming, is exactly that. Like brainstorm by yourself to try to get rid of the groupthink that you're talking about. And it's amazing to see the depth of ideas that come out, particularly from the more introverted people who are not as likely to stand up. But when given the space in advance to prep and then in the room to say everything they need to say, one, that works better for how their brain processes. And it means that the external processors in the room don't control the space because they need to talk to generate ideas and to really sort of flesh things out. But then that doesn't leave a lot of airspace left for somebody who has more internal processing and introverted
Absolutely.
approach. Yeah.
There was this great research that just came out from Harvard Business School professor Frank Nagel, and he observed 190,000 coders for the last 2 years, and half of them had access to generative AI and half did not have access to AI. So, similar controlled experiment that we ran in our research a couple of years ago. And what he found was that the folks who had access to generative AI, the coders actually specifically, they actually increased their coding activity by 12% compared to their coworkers who didn't have access to AI. So that's to be expected, slightly more productivity.
Sure.
At the same time, those who had access to AI, it reduced their project management and administrative work by about 25%. Great, I don't have to do that repetitive menial task. It also had a countervailing result, which was very unexpected. And the result was that of these coders who had access to AI, they were collaborating with far fewer people than humans who didn't have access to AI. And not by a factor of like 10%, but by a factor of 80% fewer people that they were collaborating with. And some people might say, great, software coders say, great, I don't want to talk to people. But in reality, when we were trying to create high-performing teams, one of the foundations of that is trust and communication. And so, yes, we have this great tool, AI, that can help us be more productive and reduce our administrative work. But unless we actually have, again, these cognitive friction to slow down and make us talk to each other and decide as humans where we want to go, our bias will be to talk to fewer people. And so that, I think, is not good for society. And that's not good for how we should be using this tool. And again, I think it's important that when we're thinking about the workflow, we use these tools, but then we're mindful of how we stop and pause to make sure that we are not losing trust. We are not undermining high performing teams. We are not losing the human communication, which is really critical to ultimately achieving what we want to achieve.
It's, as human beings, we're wired for connection, right? I mean, we're on the earth. And if you go back far enough, like if you weren't connected to a community, your survival was pretty much, like you were done. And in our DNA, that's still the same DNA that we operate with today. And so the fact that that there's 80% lower engagement on software engineers that were using generative AI in their programming doesn't support, as you say, it doesn't support the human connection. It doesn't support idea generation. It really makes cross-functional teams difficult because why would you even get on one, right? And then it also means that institutional knowledge gets trapped because each person kind of is trapping their institutional knowledge and their AI possibly, and not actually sharing that. So if you think about the amount of informal mentoring and influence and persuasion in a positive way that occurs in organizations through people chatting through problems together, the trust that's built through going through hard things together and coming out successful, we're going to lose all of those incredible benefits of people being able to have other people to work with.
It doesn't have to be that way.
No.
But it's likely to be that way unless leaders and your listeners who are leaders take a deliberative approach to make sure that the human is involved in this iteration and that we are making human first decisions. And so it's likely to go down that direction unless we train people and we train their behaviors and train their workflows and design organizations in a way that are mindful that this is a bias. So how do we make sure that we don't do that?
It sounds like the approach to blending community and connection in with generative AI in the way that you've just described is a pretty significant competitive advantage.
Yeah. And so I think the firms and the organizations and the leaders who double down on the activities and the ceremonies and the culture that brings people together and learn in a peer-to-peer environment and from subject matter experts is one that's going to give them competitive advantage.
Right. Since we're on the topic of teams and cross collaboration, I feel like this is the right time to talk about radical adaptability. Keith Ferrazzi and you wrote this wonderful book, Competing in the New World of Work. And one of the core concepts that yourself and Keith and Noel talk about in the book is this concept of radical adaptability. And, we're living in this world of feeling like there's this constant change. Everything is new. And trying to build systems and processes and hierarchy, like it's not working anymore. But there's another way. And I'd love if you could just walk us through, what do we need to know about radical adaptability? What are the core practices? Yeah, what have you learned?
So this book came out as a result of another crisis, which was the COVID pandemic and lockdown. And during the early days, nobody knew how to manage a team remotely because everybody was in lockdown. And so we started hosting a series of town halls just as a favor to our clients and our friends. And we bring together CEOs and CTOs and CFOs and all different functional leaders for them to share with each other about how they were managing in complex times. And this very quickly led to more research, which ultimately became the foundation for this body of work, which was researching how the most successful teams in the world thrived in what we thought was the most difficult era of our life, which is pandemic, lockdown, mass uncertainty. And we interviewed over 2,000 senior leaders from over 300 different companies all around the world. And from this conversation, and this is before AI allowed us to really distill these conversations very quickly, we were able to identify 4 key characteristics of teams that are radically adaptable. And these 4 they're going to sound like buzzwords, but ultimately they are the result of specific practices that teams do. The first one is foresight, being able to look into the future. And you might say, who can see the future? And the truth is that there are early signals to every calamity that happens. And if you can teach your team to identify the early signals of change, then you can create an action plan and you can look into the future and get ahead of it. So that's the first one is foresight. The second one is agility. How do you then, based on what you're able to identify, develop an action plan and say, okay, what is the sprint that we're going to do in the next 2 weeks to be able to actually move the ball forward in this perspective that we've identified. So create a team that is agile, developed a little bit from software development, agile software development, and that you're constantly iterating. And so that you're able to move the ball forward and ultimately get to the third phase, the third characteristic, which is resilience. When you're running against hard deadlines, it's exhausting. And people don't love constantly running into walls. And so you need to have your team to be able to recuperate, be able to re-energize from this first sprint that they had, so that they can then be able to climb the next sprint even more effectively. And so the idea of team resilience, being able to measure your team's level of energy and being able to give them the resources they need so that you are ultimately all crossing the finish line together. And then the fourth category and skill set we realize is that these teams are extremely collaborative. And collaboration, again, is a buzzword, but it is the output of a series of inputs that teams learn to practice. And these inputs include inclusive ideation, peer-to-peer coaching, small group activities, so that you can actually break through silos and get to the best ideas. So these four skills ultimately allow you to become radically adaptable in a world of complete change, regardless of what that change is or what team or company you work in.
Now, one of the things that that really struck me when I was reviewing your book is that, so I'll drop back. My fundamental belief is that a concrete foundation over which you build all leadership abilities is emotional intelligence. And that if you try to build a building without a concrete foundation, use sand, every floor above that's going to be shaky. And my experience in the last 25 years has been that if a leader doesn't have solid emotional intelligence, you can teach them how to have a difficult conversation. You can teach them conflict resolution. You can teach them all these things, how to build trust on teams. But if they aren't grounded in their own emotional intelligence, the whole building is shaky. Everything above that shakes. And I'm curious, as you did this work, where empathy fit into this model of radical adaptability, and how did that inform these steps that you just talked about?
So empathy is part of making sure that your team is resilient. And so the activity of resilience it means different things to many different people. When we look at it from a team perspective, it means that your team has the energy to be able to cross the finish line together. And you can measure that by asking surveys, questions, energy checks, giving people resources they need to be able to accomplish a work task. And empathy is part of that process, recognizing that somebody is struggling and being able to say, how can I give you more resources? Or maybe somebody else on the team can come support you. And that empathy is and can be taught. And it's not something that is always innate to everybody. I've worked with some of the most famous tech people in the world, and you can imagine that they might not have the highest empathy scores in general. But what I can tell you is that over many years of practicing particular behaviors, they've actually learned to make that skill innate. It becomes like muscle memory. Like you go to the gym and you start practicing, and eventually you get stronger and stronger, and then it becomes second nature to you. So for example, one of the practices we suggest to start creating the foundation for empathy and vulnerability and connection is this small exercise. This exercise is at the beginning of a meeting, and it's a very simple question. What's sweet in your life and what's sour in your life? It's a very simple question that opens up the window to something that is sweet, something that's giving you energy, something that's making you really happy, personally and professionally, and something that maybe is not giving you energy or detracting from your energy, and something that's sour in your life. And asking your team to share that on any way they feel comfortable, personal, professional. And so it might sound a little bit trite at first, but when we've worked with teams and we've taught them this behavior, and specifically leaders who may not have the highest level of emotional intelligence or capability, over time, this becomes second nature to even those leaders. And then they know to ask these kinds of questions to create the opening to then measure, okay, my team needs help, or we need more resources here. Let us adapt and move in that direction. So all this to say is that these are skills that people can learn. And if you keep practicing them, like you go to the gym, they will become muscle memory for you.
I love this. I'm like sweet and sour sauce. It's like it's such a great analogy to remember those two questions. And what I love that you've done is that you're grounding people in their humanness at the beginning of a meeting. And what I know to be true is that teams that are grounded in their humanness show up with more trust, more authenticity, and greater vulnerability I'll do the Brene Brown in brackets part, which is as is appropriate for the situation. And I think that by grounding it, you're speeding up the process of the meeting because everybody knows everyone else's context. And so it's no longer a hidden thing in the background. I might misinterpret your body language to mean that you aren't interested in my idea. But if I know that you have a sick dog at home and you're worried about your pet, or you've got something going on with a family member, now I'm thinking, oh yeah, you've got a pretty heavy thing going on. It's nothing to do with what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. And the challenge is, like, we as human beings are story making machines. We have this constant narrative that we're creating for ourselves. And if I know your context, I'm going to create stories in my brain that match that context. And if I don't, I'm just going to make up stories, and they may or may not serve us well. You're pointing.
I'm pointing to this quote.
Oh, I love this quote.
In imagination than in reality. And so if you don't know what's happening in your colleague's life, and by the way, I did not pick this quote just for this conversation. It rotates. And so when we imagine someone's life to be different than what their reality is, that creates the opportunity for misunderstanding and mistrust. We always say connection before content. Connect with your fellow human before you get into a content or the context of work. Because ultimately, we are human, we are social beings. Most people spend like at least 50% of their waking life at work, right? And so do you want to make it miserable? Do you want to make it terrible? No, nobody wants that. So why don't we actually recognize that we have real feelings, real authentic emotions, and real challenges and wins in our lives, and come to show up to work authentically around that. You mentioned Brene Brown, in the context that's appropriate. I would say any context is appropriate. Just be who you are. And as long as you show up in a kind way, in a real way, and in an open way, then that context is appropriate for your work context, because it is the vast majority of our waking life. We shouldn't be spending our time like hiding and our feelings or emotions or our challenges, because our colleagues are the people we spend more time with than, oftentimes our loved ones.
My dear friend, the author and speaker, Dan Ponifrac, has a wonderful quote that I just so resonates with me in our conversation, which is that he says, we're human beings, not human doings.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think this connection brings us back full circle to the conversation we had at the beginning of this conversation, which is we are in this era where AI is augmenting our capabilities. And from people have very different perspectives on it, from super optimistic to, a little bit scared. All of those are valid. And if we bring the human element into remembering how this technology is augmenting our freedom, our creativity, our productivity, that is critical, because otherwise we are outsourcing our ideas, we're outsourcing our critical thinking, we're outsourcing literally everything to an algorithm which is not human. And so we have to put the human at the forefront of AI. When we work with companies all around the world, oftentimes, I'm just going to be honest here for a second, CEOs are super excited and obviously want to have AI in their company. And like many digital transformations, they ask the CIO to lead this transformation because they think of AI as software. However, this is not a typical tech transformation. AI is not about a technology tool. AI is about the people. And so we suggest actually to CEOs this should be in the remit of the chief people officer, because it requires facilitation and adaptation and coaching and training and this entire process of bringing people along with you to empower them to how to use this. And sadly, most chief people officers oftentimes don't have the biggest budgets in a corporate hierarchy and don't necessarily have the biggest, let's just say, voice on a leadership team to be able to make this happen. That is a huge detriment to the workforce. And so when we're thinking about AI, it is about people. It is not a technology that we should be thinking about just as a tool.
That's a fascinating take on the adoption of AI in companies, to think about it as this is a tool we're giving to human beings to help to improve their workflow. And we can't think about it as just another piece of software that they're going to add onto their laptop or their phone or whatever. Like, this is fundamentally changing their experience of work, the way they connect with others, the way they connect with themselves. And we need to treat it as such.
Beautifully said.
I'm just paraphrasing what you said. So I love this idea of it being the chief people officer too. I think that's a wonderful expansion of role for a chief people officer. And there's a lot of chief people officers and heads of talent of heads of leadership development that listen to this podcast. So I know they're hearing this right now and thinking, oh, I wasn't thinking that was part of my purview. That didn't really, I did think it was in IT. I did think this rollout was more about people getting permission to use generative AI on their laptops. I didn't think about the responsibility that we have to teach leaders how to use it, how to guide and mentor their team's usage, like how team leaders can use it to make their teams more effective, how it becomes part of the review process. Imagine that you're in a one-on-one or a review, and, we do this in our company. Really, since ChatGPT came out, I sort of put the edict out. If you can figure out how to make ChatGPT do this in your role, then it's not a good use of your time anymore. I'd rather you talk to customers, talk to each other, but use this tool. And so we brought it into our one-on-ones, where each time we do a one-on-one, we actually ask, like, how are you using AI to innovate in your role, to help you to do things in a different way, to add creativity, to act as a thought partner. And that's the realm of the people department.
That's right. So last night I was at dinner with the head of AI and strategy at one of the largest social networks in the world. Everybody knows this company. And this individual was telling me that they're having a very difficult time with adoption of AI in their workforce. They were early to use generative AI tools to build products, but actually in the workforce, adopting and using it internally, it has been very challenged. So I pressed upon this perspective that, are you developing your people to learn how to use it? Do you have training programs? Do you have ways for them to be able to learn from each other, to lower the temperature of fear, to be able to actually learn how to interact with it in an effective way that actually gets them to use it, as opposed to just being a tool that they never touch? And this was a pretty shocking revelation to this head of AI at this major, tech company. And this person said, we definitely need that. We have to figure out how to do that. And we haven't figured that out yet. And so here you are, like, a major technologist and technology company who is approaching this from a tech adoption perspective rather than a people change management perspective. And they started with the tech adoption, but through this conversation, they recognize, wow, there's a huge other element of the change management that we have to actually include as part of this process. Otherwise, the tech is not going to achieve what we want it to achieve.
I love that framing, Kian, of it being a people change management process, not an IT rollout, because that fundamentally changes how we think about this tool. I think I've heard people describe, well, it's like going from having a calculator to having a spreadsheet. It just isn't. The evolution that we're going through right now is so much greater than the move from a calculator to a spreadsheet.
That's right.
From an accounting perspective.
The challenge is that people recognize, okay, maybe this is actually a people change management issue, or they're increasingly recognizing this 2.5 years into this generative AI era. However, the budgets and the resources are not matching their ability to do that. And so this is where we have this gap in adoption, is because, okay, we now need to have this change management. We need to actually develop AI literacy tools for our teams, but we don't have the resources to do that, because that's always been an IT issue or the technology department. And so this is the gap that is so critical to fill right now. And I think people are starting to awaken to this. And through our work, this is what we do. We help teams train around AI adoption, literacy development, experimentation, piloting. And in my own business, I've been, on a milk carton, screaming at the top of my lungs for the last couple of years. And finally, slowly, people are saying, wow, I get it. Okay, now we need to actually invest in that. And so this is the real gap, which is not allowing not just companies to adopt AI effectively, but all of society. Who's paying to train society on how to use these tools effectively? Right now, that's not happening. Schools, if you're, let's say, you have a child in elementary or middle school or high school, they're starting to develop some of those skills. But what about, the other 60 plus, age ranges of who aren't in school? Who's training them? And that really is, going back to the beginning of our conversation, that is my concern, is that there are some people who are going to be AI native, and there's going to be many people who don't have the ability or they haven't had the opportunity to learn. And these tools are not hard to learn, but that is very critical to ultimately making sure that this technology that we develop is widely accessible and available, and is helping augment all of human life rather than just for those who have access to this technology.
The future is here. It's just not widely distributed. Kian, thank you so much for making time to be on the podcast today, my friend. I've learned a ton. I'm sure listeners have as well. I'm deeply grateful for your time.
Thank you so much. It was so much fun chatting.